Good evening, everyone. Call the meeting to order of the joint special workshop session of the Lewisville City Council and Lewisville Planning and Zoning Commission. City Secretary, do we have a quorum for the city?
We do have a quorum of city council members, yes.
Okay. P&Z, if we can get the same thing from y'all.
Okay, we'll call the P&Z meeting to order, and we do have a quorum present.
Okay. Thank you. Is that it?
Yep.
Okay, I will turn this over to the city manager, Barron.
So good evening, Mayor and Council and board members. So this has been a long road we've been on with the overhaul of our zoning code and our land development code. You'll remember that this project started back in December of 2018. So we have worked through a complete revision of the zoning code. Legal has reviewed it. It has not come back to you yet for adoption, because now we're turning our attention to the land development code, and we'll be going through major recommended revisions tonight with you. And then, because of COVID, we had thought we would first approve the zoning code and then come back with the land development code. But because of COVID and the shutdown, basically, and all of our attention being turned to something else, we think now it would be better just to approve both of those ordinances together sometime in probably the September-October timeframe. So this has been a very long road. You'll remember this was a major undertaking. Our zoning ordinance was actually originally adopted in 1971. Was tweaked in 1995. Your GDO was actually written in 1989 and had some major revisions over time. So it's been a very complicated project, a very difficult project, but one that I think is going to have major benefits for years to come. We've had an excellent consultant team on this project. With Mark Bowers from Kimley Horn, Phyllis Gerald from City Centric Planning, and certainly Karen Walls from Strategic Community Solutions. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mark Bowers, and he's going to go through the recommended changes to the Land Development Code.
Thank you, Donna. And again, this is Mark Bowers with Kimley Horn. I am sharing my screen now, so I believe you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation that we put together this evening to walk you through the ordinance and tee up some discussions that we'd like to have with you this evening. So the agenda that we've developed, we want to start off with an overview of the structure of a unified development code. So as the city manager said, we are looking at updating both the zoning ordinance and the subdivision ordinance, and through that process, the direction that you provided to us last year is that you would like to see those combined into a unified development code. So we'll go through that structure with you. Secondly, we will wanted to go through discussion and direction on several topics. So we will start off by going through the discussion format. Karen will share with you the way we would like to structure each of the discussion elements for the topics, and then we'll go through the process of presenting 6 major topics that we'd like to get feedback from you on this evening, including a presentation of the topic and then discussion and direction from all of you in the meeting this evening so that we can go back and continue developing the ordinance. At that point, we will look at other topics that maybe we haven't covered that you would like to discuss with us before we adjourn, and then we will go through next steps with you before adjourning. And so just before we jump into that detailed agenda, I just wanted to remind you of the process that we have gone through. So we're actually on our second round of going through this process. We had done it once with the zoning ordinance, and now we're doing it a second time with the land development code and development standards. And that process starts off, and we did this the end of 2019, with a code review committee diagnostic meeting. And just as a reminder, that code review committee is made up of department heads, individuals from the city manager's office, and multiple staff members that use your codes every single day and are responsible for applying those codes to projects. So we go through a process of looking at your existing ordinance, identifying those things that are issues that we want to try to address as we update the ordinance. Second step, the consultant team then went back through the first almost half of this year and looked at updating and starting to draft a subdivision ordinance. We then went back to the code review committee, again, that committee made up of city staff, and shared some of the key topics with them, got some feedback on things that they would like to see incorporated, as well as key questions that they really wanted us to start to get some feedback from the development community and architects and builders and those types of folks that would be using your codes on a daily basis. So then we went to the technical advisory committee, and that is actually that committee that I just mentioned. It's a group of architects, builders, developers that utilize your codes so that we could tee up the direction that we were headed with the code so far, start to get their feedback, see which areas they support, which things they wanted us to look at potentially changing. And now here on May 27th, we're at this joint session with the City Council and P&Z. We will go through some of those key topics, those key issues that have arisen so far related to the code. We will get strategic direction from you on how you'd like us to handle those items and incorporate changes to the code. And then we'll go back to that technical advisory roundtable and share with them the direction that you provided with us so that they'll understand how their feedback was received and the direction we've received and how we're incorporating that into the code. We'll then quickly go back in, revise the ordinances, take it out to the community at large in a community open house, followed up with some online input from the whole community to be able to provide any additional questions or reaction they have to the code. Take that information back one more time to the code review committee for final input, and then we would prepare the final ordinances. And then, as the city manager indicated, we'll then be coming back to you later this fall to the P&Z and City Council for action, not only on the subdivision ordinance, but on the zoning ordinance as well. So that's the overall process we're following. Again, this is the second round of that process, so we're really on the home stretch for this. So at this point, I'm going to move on into the core of the presentation and feedback we'd like to get from you, and I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis at this point to give us an overview of the Unified Development Code structure.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone, if only virtually tonight. We have put together a structure for the Unified Development Code that kind of meshes the zoning requirements, land development code requirements all into one document. And a lot of things like procedures have been combined. So you'll see requirements for site plans and plats all in one chapter. You'll see all the requirements for appeals and variances in another chapter, but they apply equally then to both land development regulations and zoning. So the articles that are in gray on the screen are ones that we have already prepared the drafts for. Those are the ones being reviewed now by staff in the City Attorney's Office. And we're moving on to land development regulations, thoroughfare standards, the park development regulations, which are essentially the park fee requirements, and then the sign ordinance. So those are the articles that we're working on currently. And next slide. This is kind of a more detailed look at what's in each of the articles about the land development regulations. We have public improvements and design. assurance for completion and maintenance of improvements. That's your developed subdivision improvement agreements, your development agreements, and then we'll be moving to the thoroughfare standards, which I think Mark are on the next slide. Again, this would be your requirements for driveway spacing, median opening spacing, alleys, that type of thing, all in one separate article. And then park development standards, this is essentially the park fee requirements. We are looking at moving the fees that are currently in that ordinance to the general fee schedule so that you don't always have to come back and update that ordinance every time you want to make a change to your park fee or other fees that the city charges. For signs, we're really not proposing any new changes to the sign regulations other than just moving everything into one document so that it's easier for developers and sign contractors to find the information and to use it. And as we mentioned earlier, and as Donna mentioned, we are looking now at adopting both zoning and land development regulations together sometime in the late fall. Right now, I am busy drafting different sections of the land development regulations and reviewing those with back and forth with staff. So that's kind of where we stand and what you'll see when the new code comes before you for adoption in the fall.
So the slide that you see on the screen now shows that structure of the Unified Development Code again. And as Phyllis noted, the ones in red at the bottom are the ones that we have focused on for tonight's discussion. We've talked to y'all about the earlier ones at the last time that we had one of these joint workshops, which seems like a long time ago now. Before we move into the specific topics, we wanted to just stop a moment and see if any of you have questions or comments about the structure of the code as you see it here, or those details Phyllis showed you on the last couple of slides. And if you do, on this question and as we go forward this evening, I'm going to be trying hard to make sure that I recognize everyone who wants to make a comment. So as we go through this, if there's something that you have a question about or a comment, I'd appreciate it if you could maybe just raise your hand a little bit so that I can try to recognize you, so that we can try to be efficient and also so that everybody can get their comments and thoughts in. So I'm going to be working hard at trying to make sure that works. It's obviously not as easy virtually as it is in real time in person. But at this point, let me ask if anybody has any questions or comments about the structure of how we're organizing this Unified Development Code, including both the zoning and subdivision.
I have a question.
Yes, Kristen, please.
Actually, I have two questions. So one, backing up just a second, if we're talking about adopting this in maybe late fall, and we're talking about maybe having a community open house before we get there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm just kind of curious what the thoughts were on how we were going to handle that with all the COVID stuff going on.
Yeah,
and then I have another question after that, but I'll let you go with that one.
Okay, thank you so much, Councilman. The way that we had structured this originally and the way we proceeded on the zoning last year was that we had that community open house at the point that we had direction and recommendations on all of the segments that relate to zoning. And so we had, I think, a really productive meeting with the community last fall to talk about those different sections of the zoning revision. And we had it at MCL Grand and with different stations set up to deal with the different topics. So that worked really smoothly. Then we have COVID. So at this point, with our original schedule, we were expecting the timing of that community workshop to be around the early part of the summer, around late June or maybe early July, something like that. At this point, what we are looking to do is to get your direction on the items that we've got here, and then also to see how we can most effectively handle the timing. It sounds to me like the direction that y'all are proceeding so far, it may make sense for us to hold off on having that open house just a little bit longer so that we can do it in person. It's the sort of thing that I think we will get more attention if we can do it that way, but obviously we don't want to do it too early. I think we will have time during the summer to adjust the schedule accordingly, and I do think that we'll be in a position where we can do that. Even last fall, we also accompanied that open house with an online version of the questions and the information. So we would have planned to do that anyway. And in this situation, we may just need to do more of that or do a Zoom version of it, again, depending on the timing. But I feel pretty comfortable that we can time the process in a way that we may be able to have that once things have opened up a little more. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. And you had a second question.
Yes. So my second question has to do with the structure. So my question is related to the signs. I know that topic can sometimes be maybe a little controversial and, you know, can change maybe more frequently than we really want to update our UDO. Have you seen other cities put the sign regulations in with everything else, and how is that working out? Is that causing a problem?
Phyllis, do you want to respond to that, please?
Yeah, I think cities have done it both ways, and you've probably seen it as a standalone ordinance in some places, and in other places they do have it as part of the zoning ordinance or their unified development code. In this case, we're not planning to make any changes to the sign regulations. We've talked with the city attorney's office about that, and of course with the Supreme Court case a couple of years ago that really impacted the way cities can regulate signage. At this point, I think the thought is that we would just bring it over into the ordinance as is, rather than try to go through and make changes to it. And you know, I've been through sign code updates before, and they're not much fun. So, you know, that's the current plan.
Okay, so my question is, you know, if we did have to update it, if let's say something happened and we needed to update our sign regulations,
yes,
we would have to open up the whole UDO to do that, right?
You would be opening up that one article.
Okay, so we can do that separately.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay, that answers my question.
Okay, thank you, Councilwoman. Other comments or questions on the structure that we're suggesting at this point? Okay, Mark, if we might go on to the next. As Mark indicated earlier, and as you see, if you had a chance to look at the PowerPoint, we've structured this with a set of items where for each topic there will be a brief presentation, some recommendations, and then a facilitated discussion for you all to give us input. We are not looking for particular votes this evening. What we'd like to do is have enough conversation with you all so that we have a sense of your direction and that we can proceed with continuing to draft all of these sections of the ordinances so that you'll be able to see the details and the actual wording later on. Tonight, it's simply about trying to make sure that everybody has their questions answered as much as possible. We're all on the same page, and then we can proceed with the details, knowing that we're going in the right direction for what y'all are after. So Mark, if you can go on to the next slide. When you looked at that table of contents that Phyllis had up a minute ago, you could see that it looks pretty daunting, and especially when you go down underneath each article and you see all the individual chapters and so forth. Rather than trying to go through each tiny detail in each thing this evening, what we felt would be the most effective way for us to ask you to share your time was to organize our session this evening around 6 topics. And these these are the things where we're making changes to the ordinances that you are used to for 6 reasons. And so what you see on the screen right now are the type of changes that we're doing that we want to discuss with you this evening. And as you look at these, I think you'll recognize that each of these objectives are things we've talked about earlier on in this process and indeed back to the 2025 process. And I'm hopeful that if we organize these revisions to the ordinance according to the objectives that you have established previously, that this will help us to really concentrate on why we're doing the things, and then what it is we're doing in each one of these sections, and tying it back to your overall objectives and your goals in 2025. I'm hoping will make us have a really productive discussion this evening on the major components, and not find ourselves worrying about wordsmithing on one phrase or one sentence or another. As I said earlier, what we're going to try to do for each one of these 6 topics is Phyllis will give you a presentation. She will talk about why we're making these changes, and that will seem familiar to you, I think. Then she will go through what we're proposing to change, and then we'll have a summary slide, and at that point I will come back and facilitate a conversation with you all to get your feedback and direction, and we'll do that for each one of the 6 items that you see on the screen now. If that's workable for everybody, is that okay? Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay, let's go ahead and move forward. And again, as I said, as we get into the discussion, if you have a question or comment, please try to raise your hand or somehow indicate so that I can see that you'd like to join in the conversation, so that we can make sure to give everybody the opportunity that they want. Our first topic here, and I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis, is streamlining development review and the variance process.
Well, this goes back to some earlier discussions we've had before with y'all about how to improve the ordinances so it's easier for developers and staff and any user really to find information, to know what they need to do, what type of plan they need to turn in, what the rules are. And so one of the main goals for this is to, again, provide clear and simple procedures. We also heard from a lot of our focus group participants, engineers, developers, that there were too many variances that they needed to come in and request for different things. So one of the things that we're looking at is how to eliminate the number of variances that are required to conduct development in Lewisville. And that really leads to just making everything more efficient, not only for staff, but for the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council as these projects come before you. And of course, for developers, it's saving time and money, and those are always some of their main goals for development. We had talked earlier in this process about streamlining the processes for plan review. And these flowcharts will look somewhat familiar to y'all. The main things that we're changing in terms of residential, commercial, multifamily development, we've added an option for a concept plan, which is required for some types of development, optional for others. But that's a plan that is prepared and reviewed and approved before the developer has to go out and spend a lot of money on getting the detailed engineering plans prepared. So the concept plan allows staff and the developer to work out any major issues before the developer has invested a lot of time and money into those more detailed plans. The other major change is moving the requirements and requests for variances and what we now call administrative modifications and alternative standards up to the front of the process. Again, so the developer knows going forward that he has had approval to make or to develop the plans that he has prepared, and that he has some assurance from the city going forward that everything has been approved. And then it goes hopefully smoother and more quickly through the development process. So those are the two main changes that we've made to the development review process itself for plan review. And Mark, next slide. I mentioned earlier the variance process. I know right now a lot of variances are required from various development requirements. Some of that will be fixed by just updating requirements, modernizing those. But we've tried to establish a different, a different tiered process for variances, and really trying to move away from calling anything a variance unless it goes to the Board of Adjustment. So I think y'all have seen these tables before, but just briefly go over those. The Board of Adjustment will continue to review variances that have to do with zoning requirements like height, floor area ratio, that type of thing. Special exceptions related to non-conforming uses. They would review sign variances, and then reasonable accommodations for persons with disabilities. Staff will have a more active role and flexibility in being able to approve what we call administrative modifications, and that terminology comes from the I-35 overlay district, and we thought it was a good framework to use for these type of modifications for other parts of the development code as well. So the planning director has some flexibility to approve up to 10% on any numeric standard. Those are development standards only. Things like parking, landscape width, types of screening, and those type of requirements. The city engineer, on the other hand, would have pretty broad leeway to approve modifications to the land development requirements. And this would be driveway spacing, median opening spacing, utility location, those type of things where I think you already very much rely on your professional engineering staff to make those recommendations to you now as those projects come forward to the City Council and Planning and Zoning Commission. The one area that the planning director has a little more flexibility on is screening, the way we have proposed it. And that would be, for example, if you had an existing building or development and the owner wanted to make an addition to that, everyone thinks it's a great idea, they're upgrading the property, but he's got a wooden fence, which might not be allowed under the current ordinance. So the planning director would have the ability to make that decision to let that existing type of screening remain without having to totally upgrade and rebuild the screen. So those are some examples of what flexibility and authority staff will have to approve administrative modifications. We then move to alternative standards, which are the modifications that the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council could approve as part of a development review process. The Planning and Zoning Commission would have some flexibility on landscaping and also alternative standards that would be from between 10% and 60% of a numeric requirement. Again, that's above and beyond what the planning director can approve.
Excuse me, but Mark, could you move the slide back one, please, just so we can see the planning and zoning? Thank you.
So the alternative standards, again, an example of this might be the width of a landscaped edge if it exceeds more than a 10% request. Parking reductions greater than 10%. Those would be some examples of what the Planning and Zoning Commission would have authority over. And then the City Council would still retain authority over a lot of the landscaping requirements. I know these are comprise a lot of the requests that you have seen in the past couple of years as I've looked at your agendas. And then the City Council would have would hear appeals. So if the city engineer decided, no, I'm not going to approve that administrative modification that you're requesting, I don't agree with that, then the applicant could appeal that decision to the city council. So that's a very brief review and of the variance process and just how we're proposing to structure that. And this is a process that we had reviewed with you at the last joint meeting, and I think folks were generally in agreement with it. But I thought it would be good to review that and just see if you have any questions about that process.
Okay, and Mark, if you might go on to the next slide after that one. There we go. So Phyllis has been describing some of those things about the process, the flow charts, the authority, and I think this is maybe just looking more specifically about some of the things that we've talked about before. But are there comments? Are there questions? We hope that this is still moving in the direction you had in mind, but let me ask for comments and feedback on that.
I have a question, or
Yes.
actually a question and a comment. So on the flow chart, we're talking about the concept plan, and I know we talked about that last time, and I really like the idea of doing the concept plan. I think particularly in areas where you're doing infill, that's very helpful to be able to look at the concept plan before you go full blown into design. I did have a question with the new rules that we have on our review time of the 30 days, where that would not apply to the concept plan, I would assume. But what are we setting as kind of our internal goal of how quickly those would be reviewed? Is that something that we're committing to in here, or is that something that's not going to go in this code?
We talked a lot about that after the legislature made the changes to the 30-day requirement, and the language of the new statute pretty much pulls a lot of things in that concerning site plans that were not covered before when it was just limited to plats. So we've taken the approach that a concept plan would be subject to the 30-day requirement in terms of review. Yes. Okay.
So, all right.
And did you have a comment as well?
I also, so that was my question with a comment. I have a comment on the final plat. And I think I've said this before, my personal preference, I've just had experiences, particularly when you're doing infill, sometimes when you're working in an older part of town, you have some information about existing utilities, but when you get into actual construction, you realize that things are not where they thought you thought they were. I have actually had, I've done a project in a city where we had to do a final plat when we did our engineering plans, and we had to get it filed and everything. That was done, and then we went to construction. We figured out that the water line was not where the as-built said they were, and we ended up having to move an easement, and then we had to go back and redo the plat, which actually just cost us time and money on the project. So I like for it to be closer to, tied to once you get into construction, you have your infrastructure in place. That is when I think the plat should happen. 9 times out of 10, it doesn't matter, but it's that one time that I've gotten caught on and I had to go back and redo it, and it was just unpleasant. So I just wanted to share that comment.
There are some cities that allow a developer to go to construction with a preliminary plat approval, and then the final plat almost becomes like an as-built. It's after you've installed your utilities. If you had to make changes in easements, that can then be that change can be made on the final plat. So that is an option. It's not the process that Lewisville has been following in the past, and it's not a change that we're proposing to make with this. I mean, you're right. There are going to be those instances where you have to move an easement, the utility line gets installed in a different place, or it's not in the same place. You have private utilities that request additional pedestals or easements, things like that, that can require you to have to come back in and essentially replat to correct those things.
Okay, well, I just wanted to bring that up, and if it's already been discussed with the team and decided against, I'm fine with that too. I just thought I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that my preference is for it to be closer to the end.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think that one of the things that we talked about with the staff is by the process that we're suggesting here, having all of the staff from the various departments doing their reviews early on, that it makes it so that it's much more likely, we think, to discover those kinds of problems earlier in the process. So that's another way we would hope that might help to address that.
And Karen, if I could go back to the question about the 30-day requirement, I'm looking actually at my full-size copies of the flow charts, and we do have indicated on it that the things in green are the processes that are subject to the 30-day requirement, and the concept plan is not subject to that, so I misspoke on that. Once I looked at the full-size copy, I could actually see it.
Yeah, and I think, Phyllis, that was one of the ideas of having those color coding in there that
yes.
We could really clearly, everybody can understand right away what does and doesn't get covered by that 30-day thing. Other questions or comments on the process itself at this point? Okay. Our next topic is one that I know many of you have been really involved in, and that is to make Lewisville more pedestrian and bike friendly. So we're going to turn to that, and while Phyllis is making the presentation, I'm going to shift my headphone because I'm getting a little buzzing noise, and I think maybe the battery is out or something, so I'm going to shift over while she's talking. So I can believe I'll still hear you, but I'll be right back. Phyllis, go ahead.
Yes, a lot of cities are looking at really it's somewhat de-emphasizing the automobile as the primary mode of transportation, and while it will remain in that status for probably the foreseeable future, there's a movement to make accommodations and make it easier and safer for all types of mobility, whether it's pedestrians, bicyclists, buses, the persons with disabilities in terms of being able to cross streets safely, wider sidewalks, those type of things. And so we're looking at incorporating some of those strategies into the new ordinance. And I know the city has also done a lot of work on this already with your Complete Streets policy. But we are looking at how we can integrate that policy with the new ordinance. And, Complete Streets, there are a lot of things that cities are doing. It could be taking away lanes from automobiles to widen sidewalks and add bike lanes, adding street trees so there's it's more comfortable pedestrian environment. So there are a lot of different things that come under the heading of Complete Streets. The city has already done a lot of work in relation to making the city more pedestrian and bike friendly. If you recall, in the Old Town North small area plan, there were some recommendations for adding sidewalks, completing missing links of sidewalks, connecting trails, connecting that neighborhood to Leela and downtown. So, you know, there's already a lot of work and recommendations being proposed for the city, as well as the 2025 strategic plan, and I know y'all are working on an update now to that document. So this is an ongoing process that probably won't be just finalized when we adopt the new ordinance. You know, one of the things that we're looking at are street cross sections that could accommodate bicycle lanes in certain areas, that would have street trees, wider sidewalks. We're looking at recommending a 6-foot wide sidewalk, which currently the minimum sidewalk width is 4 feet. And so that's one of the things that is being considered as part of this update. Another proposal that we've been talking with staff, as well as the Technical Advisory Roundtable, or TAR group, is to shorten the block lengths in residential neighborhoods. Currently, the city's block length maximum is 800 feet, which is pretty long before you have a break where you could have either a car or pedestrians be able to walk through the neighborhood. What we're proposing to do is reduce that to 600 to 800 feet, and then you would have pedestrian pass-throughs if a block was longer than that. This would allow people to, you know, again, walk more easily through neighborhoods. It slows traffic down as well if you don't have the really long streets without a break. So this is one of the concepts that we're looking at. We're not proposing this for multifamily, industrial, and commercial development. Those are areas where you have larger properties, fewer opportunities for streets to be installed to break up some of those large blocks. Another thing that we've been talking about with staff is what we're calling a soft ban on cul-de-sacs. And, you know, cul-de-sacs, I think a lot of home buyers like them, developers like them, but they do tend to concentrate traffic out onto collector streets. They make it difficult to navigate through the neighborhood. For example, if your house backs up to a retail shopping center, you might have to actually go walk a half mile or 3/4 of a mile to come back around to that shopping center if you wanted to run errands. So the soft ban on cul-de-sacs would not be a total ban. There are going to be situations where it makes sense to have cul-de-sacs given topography or the existing street design, but that would be something that the Planning and Zoning Commission could approve as an alternative standard. If a cul-de-sac was approved, then there would be a pedestrian pass-through required at the end, so people could walk easily between blocks or to adjacent properties. When we talked with the Technical Advisory Roundtable group of developers, I think there was kind of a surprising agreement with this. One person commented that cul-de-sacs are overused in his opinion. So this is not a totally unheard of direction for cities that are moving to try to make their residential subdivisions more pedestrian friendly and easier to navigate through. We talked earlier about complete streets, and these are just some components of complete streets where you are really trying to accommodate all forms of modes of transportation, foot traffic, cars, buses, bicycles, and make those accommodations in a safe and pleasant manner. Another goal that we're looking at is ensuring that pedestrian areas are well and adequately lit. One of the things that we're looking at is to require pedestrian level lighting for sidewalks, walkways, and trails in commercial and multifamily areas. And this could be lower, shorter street lights. It could be bollards that have lights on them that shine on the sidewalk. But also we want to keep in mind that an adequate lighting level might actually come from parking lot lighting or building lighting. So it doesn't necessarily have to be additional lighting, but just to have a minimum level of safe lighting and for pedestrians on those walks.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Hopefully. I see TJ Gilmore has a question on that. So this is our summary slide with the discussion questions. It summarizes those slides that Phyllis has just gone through. So let's just get right into that. Councilman Gilmore.
Yeah, I do have a question on minimum level of lighting. For background, I spent a lot of time in Tucson, and there's minimum levels of lighting. There's what people think is good lighting. There's what's creating a green or sustainable type of environment. There's the impact of lighting on our feathered friends and other critters that live in the world. So what are the standards? How do you get to a standard? What's the requirement? I mean, I've got people wanting me to wander around with, you know, 1 million candle power lights every 100 feet. So
I think that is a challenge in that, you know, some people like things brightly lit and others don't want that light shining in their bedroom at night. There are challenges with doing that. I know Denton recently adopted a new ordinance that requires a minimum level of lighting. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what that minimum level is, but very similar to what we're proposing is for paths and sidewalks, again, in multifamily and commercial developments. This would not impact single family developments. But you're right, there are some challenges in determining exactly what the right level of lighting is and you know, what form of lighting that takes, whether it's bollard lights, street lights, shorter street lights, or just there's enough ambient lighting from the parking lot to meet that requirement. There are issues too with birds and wildlife and just kind of disturbing that nocturnal environment. So you're correct. There's still a lot of things that we need to talk through on this proposal.
And I guess that the question, and if I could ask you, TJ, we're still, as Phyllis said, working through the specifics of what exactly that would be. But what we hope to get from y'all is if you think it makes sense for us to try to deal with that question of having the pedestrian areas lit properly for the pedestrians to be able to use those.
I think we're going to have a great conversation about what lit properly means. I'd love to see motion activated lights for everything, so it's black when people aren't there. That's me, though.
Okay.
I know this is this is definitely an issue that has been raised many times, and what is, you know, and as Councilman Gilmore says, the question is what is really appropriate. I don't know if Councilman Green remembers one of her early campaign stops. There was one of the biggest questions that was asked at the time was about lighting, what she was going to do about lighting in the city. There's one person who brings that up every time we meet. And it's, you know, and the question is, of course, what is reasonable? What is a reasonable amount of light? and I certainly don't have an answer. I do like the 6-foot sidewalks. I like the wider sidewalks. That is, so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir.
And the shorter block length, I think, is good too. Definitely good.
Okay. Great, thank you. Councilmember Green.
Well, I just want to say, I think, the part of this was about, has to do with the pitch that I made this last year at retreat. I'm very supportive of all of it. I think it's a good idea to have the wider sidewalks, incorporate the bike lanes, essentially finding a space for different transportation modes within our right-of-ways, instead of just accommodating one, really. So I'm very supportive of that. I did have, I agree about the cul-de-sacs. I think that they're also an issue when we're talking about our 10-minute walk to a park initiative, as far as having a negative impact on that. So I like the pedestrian connection on the cul-de-sacs. One thing that I brought this up in my pitch, and I don't know how much we've looked at this or not, but if we still have screening standards that require, if we're going to build a subdivision or even a commercial development next to a subdivision, if we have to build a wall that completely separates that development with the adjacent development, that's a big barrier to pedestrians as well, because then somebody has to walk all the way out of their subdivision over to the retail. If we could somehow incorporate something that says, we want to provide those breaks in those screening walls. I mean, just a little opening for, just like we're talking about doing the pedestrian punch throughs for the cul-de-sacs. I'd like to see us do that with the screening as well, so that we're not requiring the construction of a barrier between developments.
Okay, thank you. That's really valuable input. Thank you. And Phyllis, this is something that we have been talking about a little bit as well. If you have a comment on that, and then Karen Locke, I see, has her hand up next.
Yes, my comment is basically, if we are going to be walkable, we have to be well lit. My preference is the lower level lighting, and lighting from buildings and things that maybe are already there. I don't want to overly concern tenants or owners with having to add so much, but I do think if we are going to be walkable, we must be well lit. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Other comments, and other P&Z commissioners, do you have comments or questions? John, the
only thing I was going to talk about, like, if, since my property does abut a strip center, I really don't want spacing in there in the wall or the fence, just because of security reasons, because we've had in years past people coming in through the alley to break in the houses. And in this particular alley, there's a fair amount of vehicle traffic too. So, I don't know, maybe you put a gate or something, but I just don't know about, having open access in both directions, between the alleyway and the yard.
Can I make a quick revision to my comment about that? I think it's a very bad idea to connect the rear of two different properties together, because that does invite, it just says, hey, come on, the door is
open.
Come
on in.
Right, but I'm talking about like something that if there are two developments that are adjacent, where you can have those connection points that are really more out in the open. They're not hidden in the rear of both properties.
Yep.
Right. Okay. Other comments on these topics? Karen, yes.
I also sort of feel like alleys are a problem, and we could probably stay away from alleys as much as we try to stay away from cul-de-sacs.
Okay, and we're going to have some more discussion on alleys on one of the other later topics. So I think we'll come back to that point. But once more, we've got the slide up here on the screen that summarizes the direction. And again, obviously, we've got some more work to do on the details of the exact wording and the specific standards, particularly on the lighting from what I hear from all of you. But I also think that what I'm hearing is support for the complete streets, the minimum sidewalk widths, reducing the block lengths, looking at those pedestrian pass-throughs. So those steps to make Lewisville more pedestrian and bike friendly, we will continue proceeding with working out the details, and particularly those detailed issues about safety where there are those pass-throughs, and about the lighting, what the right level is and how that can be done in a way that doesn't disturb other things unnecessarily. So with that, unless I don't see any other hands, let's move on to our third topic, which is making Lewisville more...
One comment, Karen, before you move on.
Sorry, yes. I'm sorry, I didn't see.
We were talking about the lighting, and I can tell you right now, we need better lighting than what we have now. How we measure that, we can get to that, but we definitely need better lighting. And the 6-foot sidewalk is going to be great, because it's nothing less fun than walking with your significant other kind of in single file, because you can't walk side by side.
There you go.
Maybe it's me, maybe I'm too wide, but no, I like the idea so far.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yes, Neil?
Is the hand raise function not working?
I'm not seeing a hand raise function.
You have to open the chat. I see your hand up, Neil. I did the same thing.
Okay, so because I put that in when you asked for questions, and
yeah, I'm not. Let's see what I can do about that.
I'm getting passed over.
Go right ahead. Excuse me. I'll see if I can't get this to work.
Okay, so how do you want to be? How do you want to be signaled?
No, I've got it up now. That's fine. I'm sorry. It was not set right before. I've got it now.
Okay.
So
I had 3 items I had made notes on, and some of it's been covered, but maybe not necessarily from the same perspective, or marginally so. Lighting. The first note I wrote down was dark sky initiative, and the impact to flora fauna. So that's a concern for me.
Okay.
Bollard lighting. It depends on how it's designed. If it's, how much reflection is coming off the sidewalk or street surface. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of concerns here about the type of lighting. I always want to try to make people understand we're not in the business of providing security lighting for the front yard. Mm-hmm. We light streets for traffic. We light sidewalks for people. But if you're expecting lighting to provide security for your front and side yard, that's your job. Just a quick note, but it made me think of something in general. The wider sidewalk, 6-foot sidewalk, the first thought that went through my mind sorry if I keep looking down, I've got a monitor over here with the PowerPoint on it, and then my notes are over here, so I keep not looking at you. But the wider sidewalks, first thought that went through my mind is well, at least 6 foot allows for social distancing. So if we have another virus outbreak, maybe that's a good idea. But that's all on that. The biggest item that bothered me was the shorter block length, and here's why. Conceptually, it's great. It looks great. The concern is that, and with the pass-throughs, so the 608 foot in place of 1800 foot, and maybe there's some compromise here, but the concern is that once you start to reallocate land, you run, I think, a very high risk of compromising either the quality or most likely quality or diversity of the product in order to offset that reduced land allowance. So you either end up with more dense housing or less housing units, or there has to be some trade-off there. You can't give away land to something and and tell a developer it's not going to change what you do, because we know it will. And so the concern is that the change, and that we've seen this on some products, is that it goes downhill. So I'm not sure I can get on board with a 600, 800 foot block, you know, if you want to put it in there as what do you call it, a soft ban. Mm-hmm. But to put that in as a hard item, I right now I'd be scared to death of what it would do to the product.
Okay, and I think that Phyllis, maybe if you might elaborate a little bit on the hard and the soft aspects of this, because I think the idea was to try to encourage that in places where there's room to do it and do it reasonably, and have some flexibility where it really doesn't work. But Phyllis, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think, you know, whether 600 or 800 feet is the correct number is something we can go back and talk about. I know some cities have 1,200 feet as their maximum block length. But it is something that would be subject to the alternative standards requirements. So if a developer wanted longer block lengths, they could request that from Planning and Zoning Commissioner or up to City Council. So there's some flexibility. When we reviewed this with the TAR group, they didn't express major concerns about it and seemed to be in support of it. So I think it's a trend that a lot of cities are moving towards, but I understand too the concern about the more land you devote to streets, then the developers having to make that up somewhere else in terms of, as you mentioned, smaller lots, different type of product. So there is a trade-off there.
Okay. Well, that would be a big concern for me.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Other comments on this section? Okay, maybe we'll move on to. Sorry.
I was just going to ask, like on the 6-foot sidewalk, is that going to be feasible, you know, on the east side of town? You know, like some of those streets don't have any sidewalk at this point.
I think you would see this implemented as properties redeveloped, and yes, you know, as you do now, you might have a patchwork of properties that have sidewalks and the adjacent ones don't. It could be implemented too as the city comes in and rebuilds streets and sidewalks as part of your capital improvements program. So I think you would see it end up being a combination of public and private efforts to put in those sidewalks at a wider width. You'll also have some odd transitions probably where it goes from a 6-foot walk to a 4-foot. But over time, I think the goal is to end up with the wider sidewalks.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? Okay, so let's move on to the next topic about making Lewisville more green. Phyllis?
Well, I know this is certainly a major goal of the city, and it runs throughout all of your plans and ordinances. We're looking to try to implement Lewisville 2025 recommendations as much as we can through this regulatory document, really to help Lewisville become more sustainable and healthier, and to reduce energy uses as we work through the ordinance amendments. So some of the things that we're looking at, requiring street trees in key locations and trying to balance shade and cooling benefits with impacts on adjacent infrastructure. I know there's some street sections in Castle Hills that require street trees. What we're looking at is, can street trees be implemented in other parts of the city as well? And this might be special districts that you want to emphasize, like your gateways downtown. It could be a special mixed use district. probably could be implemented over time across the city, but it would take a lot of time and effort and money to do that. Of course, when you start talking about street trees, a lot of the engineers get a bit concerned about the sidewalks being heaved up by roots, interference with utilities, and those are certainly things that we'll need to work through with the details on adding street trees. I mean, there are things that you can do in terms of, and some things that were suggested by the TAR group, looking at the type of species that are planted, what type of root barriers that you might need to install, your width of the planting beds, all things that you can look at to try to ensure the success of that tree so that it grows and is healthy and provides the shade that we're looking for without impacting the utilities. So there are a lot of things that we're looking at there on details to make that recommendation work. I know the city is getting ready to undertake an update to its drainage manual, and we're hoping that we can coordinate the two documents as much as possible so that there's overlap and one supports the other. One of the proposals that we're making as part of the ordinance update is to allow the city engineer the flexibility to approve some of the alternative stormwater designs that you see a movement now towards less concrete for drainage, more natural areas, whether it's grassy areas, gravel, rain gardens, detention, retention ponds, all these more natural ways of managing stormwater. So we're looking to make it that option available to developers and a way for the city to promote those stormwater designs by allowing the city engineer to make that judgment as to whether or not those best management practices are appropriate for that particular application. So that's one, I think, of the major recommendations that we're proposing as part of this update. We also are looking at including some provisions for EV-ready design for electric vehicles, and you're starting to see EV charging stations pop up in a lot of different types of development, shopping centers, apartment complexes, and what we're looking at is requiring that it be EV-ready, not necessarily have to be installed, but certainly have that ability to do so at a later date. What we hear from the developers, this is more than just running conduit. You have to make sure that your electrical voltage is sufficient to manage the charging. So it's a little more complicated than just running the conduit, but something we certainly think is it would meet one of the goals of making Lewisville more green.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So as Phyllis is describing these, and she mentioned on the street trees that we had the support from the Technical Advisory Roundtable with some qualifications, and I think she was explaining those from the standpoint of what kinds of trees, making sure that the trees were not going to create problems for the other infrastructure. That's really the qualifications that are noted on this summary slide. Other than that, I think that they were generally supportive of these ideas about how to make Lewisville more green by removing barriers and providing more flexibility. So with that, let's open this one up for questions or comments from folks. Anybody? I'm not seeing any hand raising, either actual hand raising or on the chat at this point. Are there questions or comments? Does that seem like a reasonable direction to proceed with?
Yes.
Okay.
I like the, I'm supportive of street trees and I'm an engineer. So we can figure out how to do it. It makes a big difference. And I think that it's really smart that we're talking about the EV ready infrastructure. I personally haven't seen that in a lot of development codes, but I think it's where things are going, and I think it's going to take us a long time to get there. But if we can position ourselves ahead of everyone else with that, I mean, it's so much easier to put it in when you build it versus having to go back in and try to retrofit it back in. So I think it's smart. I'm supportive of that.
Great, thank you. Other comments, questions? Okay, with that, then let's move on to our next topic, making compatible development easier to do. And I think Phyllis will go into this in more detail, but basically our idea here is if somebody wants to do the kind of development that y'all envision, we should make that easy for them to do. So that's the bottom line here. Phyllis, do you want to go ahead?
I think, we've talked earlier about streamlining processes, and that's certainly a goal when someone brings in a development that the city thinks is beneficial. It also really comes into play with redevelopment and infill, because those projects are more difficult to do. You don't have as much land. You end up every square foot counts in terms of trying to meet requirements. So we're looking at easing some of the constraints that we've heard from some of the focus group participants that now could be an issue when you get into redevelopment and infill, certainly. One of the proposals that's being made is to allow public utility lines to be placed under pavement. Currently, the ordinance requires those to be placed under grass. We've talked a lot with the engineering staff about this, and of course their concern is if the city has to come in and make repairs to a public line, who has responsibility then for fixing the parking lot or curbs or whatever might be disturbed. And so we're making it clear that the property owner has that responsibility if it's on it's public line on private property. By allowing the lines to be placed under pavement, this can lead to a more efficient use of land, where you are able to use more of the land for parking, things like that. That you would not be able to if you had to keep it in grass. Another proposal is increasing the width of utility easements from 15 feet to 20 feet, but eliminating the building setbacks. And your current ordinance is a little unique in that if you have a utility easement, you then have to have the building setback a certain distance from that easement. The concern is having the room to get in there with equipment to work and replace and repair those lines. So our proposal is widen the easement, eliminate the building setbacks. When we talked with the TAR group about this, they were generally in favor of this proposal. They, I think, had been using the building setbacks for landscaping and wanted to make sure that there was some ability to continue to have some minimal landscaping possibly in the easements. So we're looking at that potential with the engineering staff as well. Another thing that is somewhat unique to your ordinance is when a developer brings in a commercial or multifamily project, he has to put up an escrow and the full amount for the cost of the infrastructure. We're proposing to also allow performance bonds to be an option for the developer as well as escrow. This will eliminate some of the front-end cost for a developer who now has to escrow the amount of the public improvements, as well as get a construction loan and actually go install the public improvements. So we think this is very beneficial to developers. It would not apply to single-family subdivisions. That's in the current process in the ordinance, and we would carry that forward as well. We're also looking at the developer's share of infrastructure. You hear a lot about proportionality and what impact that particular development has on public infrastructure. Right now, your ordinance, for example, says the first developer has to cover the entire cost of a bridge, where there might be actually 4 different property owners that are benefiting from that bridge. The first guy in gets that whole cost with his development. So we're looking at going back to see if there's a pro rata process that we can set up for some of the bridges in particular, but some of the other infrastructure. And then going back to our earlier discussion on administrative modifications, if staff is able to approve a lot of the routine variances that now are coming before the Planning Commission and City Council, we think will help to incentivize and make it easier to do the type of development that you want to encourage going forward in the city. I think next slide, Mark. Again, this is talking about the bridge cost.
As Phyllis indicated, the idea here is to streamline and address some of the things that create difficulties for developers in the case where they're developing something that's consistent with what you're wanting, what your requirements are, but to streamline and improve some of the things that they run into as they try to do the development. Comments or questions on any of these? And these were ones that the TAR was supportive of these changes. Comments or questions?
Karen, Councilman Gilmore has a question.
I see you. Yes. TJ, please.
I'm asking this a little rhetorically of staff. In 9 years, how many times have we refused a utility line under pavement?
Can't think of a time. You're muted. I can't think of a time, at least in the last 6 to 7 years, that we've denied it. But I think the point here is that it wouldn't have to come to council each time. It would just be part of the
yeah, which I think is great. I don't recall a time in my time on council. Councilman Ferguson has a sharper memory than I do for this stuff, but I can't think of a time that it has come to council and not been approved. So in my mind, this one and things like screening walls and fences are things where there might be an opportunity for some streamlining, but especially for this one. So thanks. I like.
Thank you. Donna, did you want to add something else there?
No, I was just agreeing with Councilman Gilmore.
Okay, great. Other comments, or other questions?
Well, Karen, going in on that topic, most of those variances, for example, the utility lines or water lines under pavement are very well vetted by the city engineer and his staff, and they are always you want to make sure that there's a lot of consistency when they make those decisions and make recommendations to council. So I think that all kind of goes right in with what we're trying to do.
Okay. Neil.
Sorry, hit the wrong button there. So the first question I have, the public utility lines under private property sidewalks, is this also applicable to residential?
Typically this would be more like if you had a water line that was serving fire hydrants on a commercial property. Typically in a residential subdivision, your utility lines are going to be in public right of way. You could have an easement. I know the city has tried to avoid having easements on residential properties just for this reason. So typically you would find this situation in commercial multifamily development.
Not in the single family.
That's correct.
He's asking.
So I think the point is I'd like to look at carving out residential for that, that repair.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just making sure that the language is clear. I'd hate to be saddling a homeowner with repairing a sidewalk because we put something underneath it. The second question I have is, I guess I'm a little nebulous about something, widen easement and then get rid of the building setback. So, I guess I'd need to look at the numbers here, but if I widen the easement by 5 feet, I get rid of a 5 additional feet of building setback, what have I really accomplished? I'm not sure I get the whole purpose. And maybe that's just a discussion for later. And then, I don't recall ever telling somebody that they couldn't put their sidewalk or their driveway over our utilities. I think we've always approved it. I remember Dairy Queen on Main Street. I asked that question, who pays for the repair? And from that point forward, we changed policy. You pave over our line. We need to work on our line. You have the responsibility to fix your own driveway or sidewalk. So
Councilman Ferguson, this is Eric Ferris here. So a couple of comments on the 15-foot to 20-foot easement for utility easements. Remember that on a pressurized easement, that setback is 10 feet. So it would not be 20. It would be, in this case, it'd be the 15 plus 10 on either side. So non-pressurized are 5s, but on your water lines or a force main or something like that, that would be 10 feet plus the 15 in current code. So if you went to straight 20, it is more narrow. So that would be a little bit more less impact compared to where they are today for pressurized lines, I believe.
Okay. So depending on, because that's where I couldn't sort this out in my head, so it depends on what type of line as to whether this really adds any benefit or not.
Yes, sir, and that's a good question, and it's logical. And again, some of these, this is a general statement. If it's a very deep line, then that easement, this is not one. It doesn't one should, and Councilman Green can probably weigh in. But if you have a very deep line of sewer or drainage, and then your width may be much more than that because of the layback and the depth of that line. But in general, you have a 10-foot setback now on pressurized lines, 5-foot non-pressurized. So it's not straight math, but it was a good question. I can see where you were going with that.
Okay, well, and I said I need somebody to help me sort this out, so you just sorted it out. So I think that's everything I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other comments or questions? Okay, in that case, let's move on to our next topic about flexibility for infill. Phyllis.
Knowing that infill and redevelopment will become increasingly the type of projects that the city sees, we're trying to make that easier through updating the ordinance. This applies not only to residential areas, but also to commercial, multifamily, mixed use. Certainly the type of development that you're envisioning as parts of the I-35 corridor redevelops and your gateways develop. So trying to make it easier to do that type of development that we all see the trends are moving towards. Karen mentioned earlier alleys, and we are looking at whether or not the prohibition on front entry lots for single-family townhouses is something that the city should maintain. And then if there are some changes made to that, what do we do with garage placement so that the garages don't just totally dominate the streetscape? So what we have a lot of pictures in the presentation of some of the development that's currently in Lewisville in terms of front entry versus rear entry. And I think, you know, traditionally people have seen rear entry lots as more attractive because you don't have all the cars sitting out in front. You don't have garages that just, again, dominate the whole streetscape or that stick out in front of the houses, that the face of the house. I think they call those snout houses, which I've always thought was an interesting term. But so there's a lot of things to look at in terms of whether you have rear entry versus front entry lots. So what we're proposing is that lots larger than 4,000 square feet in size could be front entry without a variance. And 4,000 square feet was chosen because this is kind of the lot size where you start to transition out of patio homes and garden homes into your more traditional single-family lot. Also, you have the width along the street to have some from on-street parking, because that's another concern with small lots and front entry is not the ability to have any type of on-street parking, which we all know is a concern in every neighborhood. Again, some pictures of the different types of development. It's also as part of this set of recommendations, we would look at if you do have a front entry lot, are there ways to minimize the impact of the garage? This could be allowing a driveway that goes down the side of the lot to a rear garage. It could be a swing garage where the garage door doesn't face the street. Or if you do have garages facing the street, we're looking at setbacks where it can't stick out, you know, but a certain distance in front of the face of the house, or maybe even requiring decorative garage doors. So there are several things that we're looking at as a trade-off for allowing the front entry lots without having to go for permission to do that. We're also looking at a different alley standard that would apply to the smaller lot, single family and townhouse developments. So if we're requiring those to be rear entry, you get into situations where your standard narrow 15-foot wide alley or 20-foot wide alley really doesn't give you enough room to have people safely exit and enter garages and pull out. And so we're looking at a new alley standard or Muse Street standard, as some cities call them, that would be a 24 to 28 foot wide alley section. And we think this is really going to be better for these smaller lots, single family and townhouses.
Okay, so a lot of the comments that you see here from Phyllis are ones affecting some of the design options and trying to make sure that there's some flexibility, especially in dealing with infill. So I'm sure that there are going to be some questions and comments on this section. Who's got a comment or who has a question? Mayor Durham?
Yes.
Well, I have no comments this time.
Okay, great, thank you. Other council members?
Councilman Ferguson has a question.
Ah, okay.
So, alleys. I'm not a big fan of alleys, and it kind of goes back to that earlier comment about compromise, you know, the shorter block, about the more we convert land use to not residential use, but vehicular traffic really. The more we tend to, I think, compromise the quality of the product. I'm probably it's probably going to fly into the face of a lot of people and maybe even surprise some that I would make this statement, but I think I'd rather look at a house with an ugly garage at the front than to have to look at 28-foot wide alleys. There's a lot of maintenance there. They tend to get trashy. I don't think they solve a lot of problems as far as street parking. Some of the neighborhoods that have alleys have some of the worst street parking problems in the city. I also look at that 4,000 square feet. That's not even a tenth of an acre. That's a pretty small lot. I'm trying to visualize what really happens at 4,000 square feet that makes a big difference. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, but I'm just not a fan of land being used for alleys. It eats up a lot of land. It creates maintenance, and it's certainly not going to, I think, encourage affordable housing, and that's for me is a big goal. So that's kind of the end of my comment.
Okay, thank you, Councilman. Other comments? Kristen, yes.
Just to kind of piggyback on what Neil just said, I agree about the alleys. Actually, from just from the standpoint of why you're building twice the infrastructure, maybe not twice, but 1.5 times the infrastructure if you're going to have to build a street and an alley. And so, that's just a lot of, if the alleys become public infrastructure, that's just more we have to maintain and eventually replace. So I'm fine with not having the alleys, and that's also seems like a variance that is approved a lot with people coming in and asking to waive the alley requirement. So I think that would probably be pretty supported by the development community. I also think the wider alley or the Muse section, that's actually some stuff that I've done in some other places as well. And I actually think it works pretty well. It actually replaces the street though. So it would only, I think we're talking about this being an option only when there is no street in front of the townhomes. They front onto open space. And so the Muse is just a very narrow street. If we were to get, my concern with large townhome developments that would have this type of street section, the Muse in the rear, is the parking. Where would you have parking? Because the 24 feet, that's a fire lane. So there's not going to be parking on that. So is there a requirement that if there's, a townhome development, they have to provide so many additional spaces? If they're going to go build 100 townhomes, do they need to provide and really only put like a 24-foot alley behind the units? Do they have to put additional parking in the development, knowing that we're going to need it?
I think we would need to look at some type of visitor parking requirement for townhouses that only had the rear alleys. If there was not a street available for visitor parking, then we would be in that situation, because you're correct. In practicality, there has to be some place for visitors, to park in these type of developments.
Okay.
I have one other thought too. We talked about front entry versus alley entry. I'm on a side entry. I have a driveway that comes down the side of the house. I look at the land that's consumed by an alley, and then the maintenance that puts upon the city for upkeep, and they tend to get trashy too because of trash trucks going down through and people deciding to toss things out and letting weeds grow and things overgrow. And I asked myself, for all that land use and then the maintenance falls back on the city, why not just tell the developer, look, give everybody a side entry and let them maintain their own driveway and eat up the land that way.
Thank you. Phyllis or Mark, other comments on those suggestions?
I don't have any other additional comments.
TJ. You're on mute, TJ.
Hi. I'm running dual monitors. I don't know where my mouse is. There's a button somewhere here. I can't find it. Yep,
we got you now.
So I live in one of these developments with an alley, and I don't disagree with any of the comments that are made. I would say that from my time dealing with large trucks driving through alleys collecting garbage, alley infrastructure is really not set up quite that great for those vehicles. They're constantly clipping people's right-of-ways or digging trenches or tripping fences, and it's just because there's just not enough space on these things. Maybe newer standards are better. One thing I would say here that I kind of like about the front entry on the smaller lots is maybe we can actually eliminate a lot of the street side parking if there isn't any. I mean, effectively you'd have the two bays in the garage, and then you'd have their driveway, which would be another 2 slots. But then the front of the house is so narrow that, you know, they're not going to park necessarily directly behind their own vehicles on the street, and they can't park within so many feet of the mailbox. Now, some of these developments maybe do the collected mailbox thing, but to my mind, when you get alley neighborhoods like mine, you basically triple down on parking. You get the garage, you get the rear driveway, and everybody parks in the street. So we have neighborhoods like the ones over by LHS. While they aren't alleys, they are stacked high and wide with cars everywhere. And, you know, I would think that if we're looking at these types of setbacks and this kind of flexibility for infill design, we would also want to look at how do we maintain a neighborhood that doesn't look like a used car lot, that people actually use their garages because the design standards kind of force them to use their own driveway and garages. So those are just thoughts.
Okay. Okay. I think this is really a helpful discussion. It gives us a lot of work, a lot of areas for us to dig into as we look at where to go from here. I think that's very helpful. I appreciate it. Bob, I think I see your hand up. Bob, Troy.
Yes, I was just going to say that I too live in an alley rear entry development, and I agree with everything that Councilman Gilmore said about the alley. It does lead to what looks to me to be more on-street parking, because people, for some reason, don't want to pull into their driveway, and so they just pull up on the street. And the comments about trucks going down the narrow alleys is definitely true. I have a big rut in the alley off of my property due to trucks that have been didn't stay on the pavement. So, yeah.
Okay.
I want to go back and also emphasize one comment I made. As you use up this land for an alley, and especially on your 4,000 square foot lot or even a smaller lot, everything's a compromise. What impact is this to creating affordable housing? Mm-hmm. Because we give up the land for an alley, then something else has to give. So, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That's a really important point. I'm glad you reiterated that. Thank you very much.
Just one quick comment. If we're going to allow alleys and we need to widen them, I mean, I'm not for or against either way. I grew up with alleys, and the alleys where I grew up were a lot wider than what we have here. And they're right. What they've built in the past has not been easily accessible, and the trucks are getting bigger. So we definitely, if they want to do it, we need to widen the footage that the alleys will be if they want that option. Just want to say it because some people may want it. If they don't, that's fine, but we definitely need to make sure that there's space if they do want to do that.
Okay.
So we can eliminate some of the problems that we're seeing now.
Right.
Yes,
Now,
so
I got people's
quick-
personal vehicles too big. Their personal vehicles are too big for the alleys, not just a garbage truck, like their dually pickup truck.
Well, they're gonna have to make some hard decisions.
One thing to keep in mind, Council, is through the years in the 70s and early 80s, your ABC streets off of Old Orchard, those are 10-foot pavement sections and a 15-foot alley right-of-way. And then the standard was changed in the late 90s to a 12-foot pavement in an 18-foot right-of-way with corner clips on the rear yard fences. Now that's still pretty narrow, but I believe that is still your current standard. So you do have a patchwork quilt of various alley configurations in the city, including some that are narrower than that in a few sections of Lewisville.
Thank you, Eric.
And maybe widen that standard may have the effect that they don't want alleyways, but maybe if we widen that standard for new alleyways, maybe they'll decide to go ahead and build the front so they can use more. But we definitely need wider. If they're going to build alleys, they're going to have to build them wider than what we have now.
Okay. Any commissioners, any other comments? Okay. All right, well, I can see we've got some work to do on this section as far as the alleys, the spacing, and how the use of land is going to play into the quality of the development and affordability. So I think then our last section for tonight is on clarifying and updating the engineering standards. So Phyllis, you want to take us through this last one?
Well, as we are going through this ordinance update, we're looking at a lot of the standards and certainly ones that come before the Commission and Council frequently for variances. We're looking at those, but a couple of things that we've been discussing. One is improving traffic circulation and reduce accidents where residential streets change direction. And this would essentially be where a street makes a turn. That we're looking at requiring eyebrows on those streets to give people a little more room to get around the corner. And then linking back to making Lewisville more green and the updates to the drainage manual, leaving more creeks and drainage ways in a natural state rather than channelizing them. And this is something, linking trails and just generally trying to keep more of the natural environment rather than paving a lot of the drainage areas as has been done in the past. So those are kind of the two major areas that we're looking at as part of this update, along with a lot of other smaller changes too. Again, going back, coordinating the changes that you're looking at as you update the drainage criteria manual, standardized dedication and maintenance responsibilities for drainage and floodway easements. Currently, depending on whether it's a single-family subdivision, a multifamily, commercial, there's some confusion or it's just not clear as to who gets to own and maintain those drainage areas. And of course, it's always important for the city, even if the city doesn't own the drainage area, to have the right but not the responsibility for maintenance. So if a private property owner is not maintaining that area, then the city needs to be able to come in there and do so. So we're looking at those, trying to standardize those requirements. And then if a street makes more than a 45-degree change in directions, we would add an eyebrow requirement, but we know that also impacts lot layout and lot yield. So we would have to go back and make some adjustments to how you measure lot width and building setbacks so that the developer isn't unduly penalized by adding these eyebrows. So those are kind of the major changes that we're looking at this point.
Okay. comments and questions on any of these?
2 thumbs up.
Okay.
I have a question about the drainage. So the, you know, I agree that and I'm an engineer, but there's nothing more than I hate to see than a drainage channel that is completely lined in concrete. It's just sad. So, but I also understand why it's done, because I understand that it's a space thing. So if I put concrete on it, then I can have my side slopes a lot steeper and it takes up a lot smaller footprint. And it doesn't impact the development as much. So I was kind of curious on what, if you had talked to the development community about that particular one and what they had, what their reaction was. And also I wanted to know what exactly are we looking at putting additional buffers on that? Or what are we really talking about when we say we're going to standardize the maintenance and, or is that really just the maintenance and we're really not going to talk about how are we going to get them to leave it in its natural state? Is that going to be a requirement? Is it going to be something we incentivize? What's the thoughts on that?
We're looking at making it a requirement to leave a creek in its natural state. And I know this is a feature of a lot of cities' ordinances. It may not always be possible, as you say, but that would be something that the city engineer would be able to review and make a recommendation. But the default position would be that you leave the creek in its natural state. In terms of the maintenance, right now the ordinance talks about dedication of the floodway, and then you've got the floodplain, and then there have to be maintenance areas on one side or both sides so that the city can get equipment in there to maintain. So we're looking at how do we make it clear what's required in different types of development. But those are the kind of the 3 components: your floodway, your floodplain, and then the maintenance areas that are required on for those to ensure access into those drainage areas. So those are what we're looking at.
Okay. And what kind of reaction did we get on this one? Did we talk about this one with the development community?
There was some discussion. I don't recall any major concerns about it when we brought this up.
Yeah, as I recall, I think a lot of them are starting to see that this is more common practice in the region. So I think many of them are more used to how it works, and I think for some of them they're seeing the amenity value of the natural spaces. So I think they were generally in agreement.
Okay, that's good news.
Richard might have a different recollection. That's the way I recall. Other comments, other questions? TJ?
Yes, that is my recollection, yes. I think they were generally in support and felt that it made sense.
Yeah, thank you. And TJ, did you have another question?
I did. So in my long life, I've gotten really good at using context clues to figure out what things mean. But in this case, I decided, I need to go to Google. And so I typed in street eyebrows. Nothing looking like concrete showed up on my Google search. I'm just going to let you know that. So do we have a graphic? Can you show me what a street eyebrow looks like? Right now, I've got Muppets running through my head.
Kind of like a partial cul-de-sac looking thing.
Yes.
Like a partial cul-de-sac looking.
It's kind of curved out. Like on if you take a turn this way, it's kind of curved out a little bit more. It looks like an eyebrow.
So the street gets a little extra wide?
Yes.
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 And so people park there.
Eric.
Very exaggerated. It's exaggerated, but something like that.
That looks more like an elbow, Eric.
Well, it's fast and quick. I don't know.
Okay. I was envisioning like an extra raised curb, where somebody was kind of looking at me funny. I just, that wasn't coming to mind. Now, do people like use that for street side parking? I mean, I think I've seen that in some neighborhoods. Granted, it's not legal.
Have some.
They park in that?
We are. So there are some eyebrows in Lewisville on 90-degree turns, and again, where you have lot lines that come into that, they do park on it, but the intent, again, is to avoid two 90-degree angles of your street, so the outside radius is skewed a bit. I drew that a little like his eyebrow, someone punched someone in the eye, but again, the idea is you get more outer turning radius to your 90-degree turn, hence a quarter or a half of a cul-de-sac, but there are some in Lewisville, and cities do use those. And again, lot lines, radial lot lines, you adjust that as those front, if you have lots that front it, and yes, they can park on them, but again, that's a function of your outer turning radius and whatever that is.
Sure. You want to break the back into your car and slide it in the corner. I got it.
And to Councilmember Gilmore's point, one of the things we're doing, Phyllis has been working very hard on the language and updating the ordinances, but we are also working hard in developing additional graphics that start to explain some of these concepts a little bit better that people won't be able to find in Google. So
this was a great one, by the way.
There'll be a much better explanation on many of these things graphically.
No, and no offense taken, guys. It's sometimes we get into the lingo and jargon, and I just wanted to make sure I knew what I was thinking, and you helped clarify that. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Mary Ellen?
The eyebrows are also referred to as knuckles in a lot of situations in a lot of communities.
I'm not Googling street knuckles. It's not happening.
Okay, Mary Ellen, did you have a comment?
Oh, I just wanted to thank TJ for getting that clarification, because I was looking at that and wondering all kinds of strange things.
Okay, great. Other comments or other questions or other vocabulary searches?
So are we unable to, dictate, I guess, anything about street parking? Because it sounds like we're building around it more than, trying to get people to use their driveway, use their garage.
Well, in terms of street parking, that's a challenge in every city. And it's difficult to, some cities will do resident-only parking if street parking is being impacted by a DART station or something like that. But parking restrictions apply equally to everyone. And so I know some neighborhoods will say, well, we want you to prohibit, the people that live over there from parking on our street, but we want to be able to. So there are just a lot of challenges with trying to prohibit street parking. And I don't know that it's done really successfully in an equitable manner.
So to John's point, to John's point though, does an eyebrow encourage more street side parking and end up actually creating higher speeds through a neighborhood? I mean, what are the statistics on that? I mean, I tell people all the time it's counterintuitive, but the more cars parked on your street, the less accidents you're going to have.
I disagree with that.
Well, the reality is it's true, because you can't drive fast. The more wide open the street is, the faster you're going to go. And there's study after study after study that shows that.
Well, I guess maybe my street's a little unique, but it winds, in different parts, and people park because of the curve. So to me, I'm shocked that there's not more, head-on collisions in those sections of the street. Because people still come through more than 20 miles an hour, you know.
Yep.
Honestly, to me, the thing is, like, if you're gonna, I've asked for years since I've moved here, is you're gonna, you know, have parking on the street, it should be on one side or the other, but not both. Because it's happened on our street where somebody, you know, a fire engine was trying to get through and could not, because it could not maneuver down the bend because there was cars on both sides.
I would say the fire department has no problem. They'll just run over the cars and push them out of the way. And that is what they've said over the years. So they don't have an issue with it.
Okay.
Donna or Eric, Claire?
Well, so just historically, again, I'm going to go back to the ABC streets. Those streets are typically 26 to 27-foot pavement sections in a 50-foot right-of-way. Your current residential rear served street is a 31-foot back-to-back street section in a 50-foot. If it's front served, then it's 33. And again, the only sections in Lewisville that I'm aware of that we prohibited residential parking in front of the homes are typically where a school is on the other side of that residential street, and that's typically a 31 or less wide street. We've restricted some parking, I think over by DeGan Elementary and a few other sites where the school actually fronts on the other side of residences, but we did not restrict the parking in front of people's homes. It's always been a very contentious and an emotional topic where you get into something like that. And I think Claire was going to add something about HOAs and things.
Yeah, so there is a difficulty with the public so the police department enforcing parking. I mean, it can be done, but again, Eric was talking about the difficulties we've had because it's a hot button topic. But what could be done prospectively for new development, all new development in Lewisville for residential subdivisions have to have HOAs. And there are some HOAs, we don't require this now, but there are some HOAs that require you to not to park overnight on the street. So we could look into, could we require already HOAs, but require that to be part of the covenants, and then the HOA has to enforce that going forward. That doesn't address existing ones, but that could address some of the issues going forward with the new development. If that's something that interests the council, we can explore that further, and the board.
Is that
Councilman Ferg? I'm sorry. Keep going. I was going to answer Councilman Gilmore's question.
Go ahead, Aaron.
So Councilman Gilmore is asking, Councilman Gilmore is asking, so what does the eyebrow solve for? So again, you have a 90-degree street intersection where there's two different street names. There's no stop sign, but again, it's a street intersection, so that gives you more turning outside radius. If you think about it, you would come up and again, a 90-degree turn for two streets intersecting. Typically, it increases some maneuverability for larger vehicles or whatever on your outside turning radius. Your inside radius is basically zero at your 90-degree curve, but a lot of times they'll curve those at 10 or 12 foot on the inside radius, but basically, Councilman Gilmore, it gives you more maneuverability through that street intersection on the outside radius to get around the turn.
Is that meant for residential drivers? Is that meant for our fire department? Who's the target?
It's both. It's anybody going down that public street, and again, it's a function of how wide that street is, and of course, the inside radius. And again, how those lots are configured in that situation. There may be no lots on the outside radius of that eyebrow. There could be front yards on that eyebrow. It just depends on how that subdivision was laid out, similar to a cul-de-sac. There's many cul-de-sacs in Lewisville that at the center of that cul-de-sac, there's no lots, but it's on the side. So everything depends. It depends on your your topography and everything else. So, but in short, it helps maneuverability through that 90-degree turn.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. And Karen, I know you have a question. But Karen, you're on mute.
Thanks. I don't have a question as much as I do to clarify for TJ. Bobbing Drive has what I consider two eyebrows. Both of them create better visibility on those corners, and they do slow down traffic.
Okay, thank you. Other comments or questions on this this segment?
How do they slow traffic? I'm sorry, and Councilman Ferguson has his hand up. Let Neil go.
Go ahead, Neil.
Just a couple of comments. If the concern is parking, misusing the eyebrow for parking, I don't see any reason you can't put up a couple of signs that say no parking between signs. And then the other comment is that as far as trying to put up signs that say residential, resident parking only, ask the folks along Greenville Avenue neighborhood how well that's worked out, because it's been a total failure. I think they're ready to just pull their hair out. So those are my two comments.
Okay, thank you.
Can I go back, Karen? You said it slows traffic?
Yes, sir. As you approach those curves, because it really is a curve, people do tend to slow down. I've watched it, and I mean, we've lived here 20 years, and I watch how it happens all the time. I slow down. I can see enough farther into that curve to know what's coming, but still I slow down. So I don't know if it's just a mind thing or what, but it does seem to slow traffic in that section of the street.
Gotcha. Because my anecdotal is, if you can see better, you go faster.
The curve is enough to make people slow down. I think it's the way it is curved.
Yeah. Well, that may very well be. So that's my concern on this is, if I'm improving sight lines to make it easier for people to travel through residential neighborhoods, I don't know how that's a win. Mm-hmm. I think that all that does is increase speeds within a neighborhood.
Okay.
Now, I'm well open to data that disproves that.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman. Other comments or other questions on this section?
I just wanted to make a comment, this is Mary Ellen.
Oh, yes.
That if you want to get a review, I suppose, on street parking, and I know nobody's really nuts about it, but go on the Nextdoor website occasionally and listen to people who have just the absolute anger at someone that they do not know, who is not visiting them, parked in front of their house. The conversation is insane.
Yeah, that's true. I've seen some of that kind of talk on Nextdoor as well.
You mean I don't own that street?
No, I guess you don't, and we have to let you know that on occasion.
There you go.
You could ask them to repair, though, if something happened to that front and they had to dig that up. If it was their street, they could fix it. I'm kidding. Never mind.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you much. Okay. It looks to me like we've got some work to do and some clarifications on a couple of these, but that we'll continue to move forward with those details. And your comments and your concerns tonight have been really helpful to us as we will continue to work on those. So with that, I think that was the last on that topic. Are there any other issues that anybody would like to raise or ask about that we haven't covered this evening related to the development code? Yeah. Neil, was that a comment?
No. Oh, sorry, my mic's still on. No, I was looking through my list. I'm good.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, in that case, Mark, let me turn this back to you and you can talk about the next steps.
Thanks, Karen. Again, appreciate all the conversation and hard work you did this evening. I think we've got some real good direction on where we need to tighten things up. We will be, at this point, going back to the Technical Advisory Roundtable, the group of developers, builders, architects, engineers, providing them with the comments that we heard from you this evening and the direction that we are taking and incorporating those into the ordinance. That meeting is going to be on June 4th at 3 p.m. At that point, we will be going back and actually incorporating some of these changes and clarifications into the ordinance and bringing it back to the community in the community open house and for additional input online. Again, we'll be going back to the Code Review Committee, that committee of city staff members, for any final comments and direction that we need to incorporate, and then prepare those final ordinances to bring forward to you, as we said, later this fall for P&Z consideration for action and council consideration for adoption. So again, we appreciate your time this evening. That is what we needed to be able to continue to move forward with the process, and I thank you. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Mayor Durham and Chairman Davis for further action.
Further action being to adjourn, I think you mean, Mark.
Okay, the Planning and Zoning Workshop session is adjourned by acclamation.
I'm sorry.
Mayor Durham?
Yeah, I was going to ask the city manager if she has anything she wants to add before we close.
I do not, Mayor. I think all of these comments, though, were extremely helpful and have given us additional direction, and we're going to move forward.
And
we're going to hit that October. We're going to hit that October time frame as long as we don't have any more COVID peaks.
Okay, and the deal about the June 4th meeting, how is that going to be held, or where? Or?
That will be the meeting of the Technical Review Committee, the Advisory Committee, which is the developers, and that will be an online meeting. We held the last one with them online as well, and that worked pretty smoothly.
I was almost sure that wasn't a come one, come all meeting.
No, it isn't.
Okay, thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Second. And if the city secretary will call the roll.
Mayor Pro Tem Troyer,
Aye.
Deputy Mayor Pro Tem Ferguson,
Aye.
Councilmember Gilmore,
Aye.
Councilmember Jones,
Aye.
and Councilmember Green.
Aye.
Okay, we are adjourned, and thank everybody for showing up tonight.